morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night, wherever you are, and welcome back to Achampnator Reads. Today I read chapter 33 of The Last Elf. Let's go. Since the passing of her father and mother, Robbie hadn't had her hands on a chicken thigh. The, mo- the meat melted deliciously between her teeth. It had the taste of a mother cooking, a father hunting. They'd even used some rosemary. She didn't know whether to gobble the meat down so that the hunger would pass more quickly, or eat slowly, one morsel at a time, to make it last a little longer. There were people everywhere. They were all in rags. They looked tired. Some of them looked ill. Josh was trying to gather them all together in a hurry. Sooner or later, and sooner rather than later, the cavalry would come from Delagar, and then everyone would long for the slavery of the farms as a happy age of gold, because what would happen next would be infinitely worse. Josh was injured, he was limping. He tried to assemble all the people, but the impression was that of a herd of sheep with a lame sheepdog. As soon as it seemed that they were all there and could get going, a few of them would start wandering off again, going to get something, heading in search of one last bunch of grapes, hoping for a final piece of bread or a mouthful of beer that might still have been lurking somewhere around. Robbie understood. They had been in a state of despair for such a long time that they couldn't even hope to escape. When you have years of hunger and weariness behind you, tomorrow becomes a difficult thought to keep. All that fills your head is the here and now. Be a bit less hungry now. Stay here because walking is an effort. If you've only ever taken orders and been whipped when you try to do something you haven't been ordered to do, you find that you can't do anything you haven't been ordered to do, not even to save your life. The fact that was the fact was that they were so used to being fearful that the threat of a possible attack by the cavalry of Delaga didn't bother them. It didn't seem any worse than their own hopelessness, which had oppressed them all their lives. And then they reflected that slaves don't get killed because you'd have to do their job yourself. That wasn't the case, however. If they didn't get away in a hurry, they faced the fate not of a slave, but of a corpse. A corpse without a name, without a grave, abandoned in the middle of the mud for the worms, the vultures, the crows, and the rats. Besides, they didn't really believe that there was a chance of getting away. Sorry, guys and girls, I have to shut up my phone. Besides, they didn't really believe that there was a chance of getting away, and it was clear that they couldn't do it. All they wanted was to scrape together a few more mouthfuls and then accept whatever life had in store for them. They had never grown used to being hungry, so that not losing uh, even the tiniest grain of corn, the smallest grape, seemed more important than avoiding a clash with the cavalry. Robbie shut her eyes. Blue formed behind her eyelids. Now she could make out the waves. She even heard the sound they made and saw white birds flying toward the horizon. She saw a beach and recognized some figures. The little old woman who was playing with Kala, the slightly bent one with the stick, the hook-nosed man who was currently standing in the middle of the vines. On a fishing boat, she recognized Falco and Foul Pest. They were destined to make it. Yosh was clearly capable to guide them. He didn't know it, but there was something he must know how to do. Something he considered insignificant or not useful at that very moment. Something that was actually extremely important. What can you do? Robbie asked Yosh bluntly as she joined him. Yosh was puzzled for a moment, then began to list the things he could do. The first things that came to mind was his ability to bring midges back to life. And Robbie had to summon all her faith lest she lose heart. And then the list was enriched with lightning fires without tinder, opening locks without keys. He could raise a wind that confused his enemies, as he had done in Daligar, but that took a lot of effort. He had managed to do it just for a few moments, and then he had been able to get his strength back for half a day. He could heal wounds. No, not his own, only other people's. He could bring midges back to life. Had he mentioned that already? And rats. And chickens. Once a rabbit. Over the past 13 years, he had mostly read. He was very good at reading. He could read 7 different languages, not counting Elfish. He had spent 13 years in a library that had more or less everything, including books on military tactics, but they explained what to do when there were 2 armies. And now they had an army on one side and on the others a band of, well, perhaps they should forget military tactics. He had read books of astronomy, alchemy, ballistics, biology, cartography, etymology, philology, philosophy, how to make grape jam, and then there were the stories. What stories? The ones he read to the dragon. No, not this one. The other one. The parent of this one, when it was brooding. Dragons brood female? He didn't know. He had never quite worked out whether it was male or female. But when a dragon broods, its brain doesn't work all that well because brooding makes it very tired. No, dragons don't have their brains in their bottoms. They have them in their heads, like everyone else. But when they're brooding, they don't work all that well. Then you have to keep them company by telling them stories. Like the story of the Princess of the Beans. What's the story of the Princess of the Beans? Robbie asked. Well, once upon a time, there was a queen who couldn't have children. And she was terribly sad, because her life was draining away, month after month, season after season, and she had no one to cuddle. The silence was almost complete. Even the ones who were munching on something had stopped. Robbie had forgotten everything. She had even forgotten to finish gnawing on her little chicken bone, and only wanted to listen. She felt as though everything that was happening, including the impending arrival of the delicate cavalry, was at that moment less important than the terrible sadness of that unfortunate queen, which filled her now. Yosh stopped talking and looked at her in puzzlement. Go on, cried Robbie. What happened next? Asked someone else. Come on, don't stop. How does it end? The ones who had heard the story from the beginning told the others who hadn't heard it and were coming quickly to listen. Yorsh looked at them for a long time, more and more perplexed, and then started over again. He raised his voice, and without breaking off, he looked about him. Everyone had gathered around to hear his story. He started to count them, still without interrupting, even making his counting part of the story. At the point when the queen is in the field of beans and starts eating them, he counted them out one by one. They were all there. They could get going. Astrid was less than a day's walk away. There was water along the road in the form of streams and waterfalls. Their beliefs, their bellies were full. They might be able to make it. Still, telling his interminable story, Josh woke Erbrow, who had started snoring again, but put the two smallest children on Patch's back, while he himself took lightning because his wand prevented him from walking, climbed on backward, facing the crowd, and set off. The dragon brought up the rear. Not for a moment did he stop, complaining about how at every step his headache was a match for the pain in his back feet. Not to mention his backache, but he did keep his voice low enough for George's story to be heard. The story was endless. Each time it sounded like it was about to end. He started off again with a new discovery, a fresh abduction, a belated realization, another evil deed, another duel. The sun rose, the layer of mud grew thinner, legs began to tire. The desire to sit down for a while on the edge of the road increased, step by step. The smallest children took turns on Patch's back, but the others had to walk. Yosh's voice had grown hoarse, but he didn't stop. The strolling players had taken out their flutes and started to underline the important points out of the story with musical accompaniment. When the princess of the beans began to flee the ogres with her people, the music became louder and more piercing, and Yosh had been able to break off to take a drink of water when he started up again. The story he told had become curiously similar to theirs. There was a flow of refugees, and the only way they could save themselves was to go on marching. Robbie listened to their despair, their hopes, their fears, their courage, and felt within herself the fierce desire not to stop, to go on step after step, until the final stretch of the road they had dreamed of, the one that wouldn't stop until they reached the sea. She looked around. Exhaustion had vanished from the faces of the others, too, drowned out by the story they were listening to, which warmed them from within like a fire. The only one who was completely exhausted was Yosh. Not only was his voice getting hoarser and hoarser, but his hands had begun to tremble faintly. The sun began to sink towards the west. Soon they would disappear into the dark mountains. Just past the last bend, when the remains of what had once been the village of Astrid became visible, everyone finally understood why the Delica cavalry wasn't following them. They were right in front of them, masked in Astrid, blocking the gorge. That was chapter 33 of The Last Elf. Next time, I read to you chapter 34. But till then, see ya.